Awesome. It looks like we have a good room of people. Like I said, I'm Anafi, founder and CEO of The Flip Side. I'll be moderating the panel today. I'll give a very quick introduction to our amazing panelists, and then we'll just dive right in because this is a heavy topic and we only have an hour. So we have Vera Zakem. She's the CEO of Zakem Global and the Senior Tech and Policy Advisor at the Institute for Security and Technology. We have Al Baker, who's the senior editor at Logically. Actually, Logically is the host of this panel. Thank you, Al, for hosting this great panel and enabling participants to ask questions and getting us all here today. Then we have Asha Rangappa. She's the legal and national security, one of the legal and national security analysts at CNN. She's also at Yale Law, and you can follow her Twitter account. She's quite feisty on there. And then finally, we have Baybars Örsek. He's the director of the International Fact-Checking Network at the Poynter Institute. And Logically just became accredited via the International Fact-Checking Network. So Al and Baybars can maybe walk us through that process really quick. But before we dive into the sort of nitty-gritty of the topic, I kind of want to level set for all the attendees here what we're talking about when we talk about fake news. So I'll start with you, Al, since Logically is the biggest fact-checking network. What do we mean by fake news? And can you define misinformation and disinformation for us?
Thanks very much. So there's, I mean, right away we would landed into a difficulty in that the term fake news was famously popularized by Trump as a strictly derogatory term. So it's come to mean both just any news which the speaker doesn't approve of, as well as like a slightly more technical and accurate, but still really not sufficiently technical and accurate definition as fake news as information published on websites or outlets which has the kind of appearance of news, which has all the rhetorical and kind of formal trappings of news, but which is unreliable for one reason or another. So fake news as a concept is a slippery one. I'm sure the panelists will have lots of different views as to the usefulness of the term. I'm not convinced that it is a helpful one to kind of focus on. I know that's interesting given the title of the title of the panel, but perhaps we can talk about how we should understand the problem. I think probably a better way to understand the problem is the distinction that you pointed to between misinformation and disinformation. Mm-hmm. I know in the field the distinction there is between information which is put out deliberately to mislead, which is disinformation, and misinformation, which is a broader category of information which is malused in one way or another. Again, I think there are really interesting distinctions within those categories, which it would serve as well to kind of bear in mind if we're trying to think seriously about the problem. But we can definitely get into that later. I hope that was a helpful start.
Yeah, that is a helpful start. You're right. Fake news is used differently by different people. So we should be careful when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, what we mean. So let me clarify moving forward what we're talking about when I do ask the questions. Asha, we are, most of the people who are attending this panel are probably aware that Russia and other state actors and non-state actors have been engaged in active disinformation campaigns leading up to the 2020 election. Would you say that it's more sophisticated or more organized or more well-funded compared to the 2016 election? Are we doing a better job of fighting against it? How has the landscape changed in the past 4 years?
That's a great question. I think, one of the things that we need to understand about these Russian disinformation operations is that they aren't new. Perception management, disinformation has been an intelligence tactic for forever. What's changed is the platforms make it much easier and cheaper and faster to disseminate the false information, making it a bigger threat than it would have been, say, during the Cold War, when a disinformation operation would have taken 5 to 7 years. So for example, one successful disinformation operation that the Soviet Union propagated was the idea that the US government created the AIDS virus as a way to get rid of the Black and gay population. And this actually gained a lot of traction, and there's still, you know, remnants of that today. Now it takes just a couple of hours to plant that story. So it's very cheap. I would say that what's changed since 2016 now is, unfortunately, I think that rather than trying to counter it with some kind of unified policy, you know, stance among, you know, citizens in the US that this is a problem, these tactics have actually been adopted by domestic actors who figured out that this is actually, this can work. And I think that what has happened now is that we've shifted the nature of a problem from a national security threat from an outside entity to one that is actively being used by domestic actors, which actually makes it a much more difficult problem to counter, you know, given our laws and free speech protections.
So one thing that that's interesting that you point out. I mean, we have lawmakers now who are promoting conspiracy theorists on Twitter, etc.
They're elected now to Congress.
Yes, yes. We do see Facebook and Twitter taking a more active role. So Twitter is now, you know, not afraid to fact check, you know, conspiracy theorists on their platform. Facebook has said they're not going to accept any new political ads in the week leading up to the election. Do you think that's enough? Do you think they should be doing more? Do you think they should be doing something differently? Vera, Baybars, please feel free to jump in as well, and Al.
I'll start and then let others jump in.
Right.
I mean, I think that we are in a really bad place when we are relying on the goodwill of these tech companies to self-police, knowing that often many of the things that they need to do to combat this problem are really fundamentally counter to their financial bottom line. It would be as though we had expected the tobacco companies to, you know, get people to quit smoking. I mean, it's not going to happen. That's not in their interest. So yes, these are great starts. I think my co-panelists will have ideas for other things, but I think we can't, relying on that alone is not a great strategy.
Yeah, I would 1,000% agree with Asha on this one. And then for a couple of reasons, you know, I keep on saying, you know, platforms can only do so much, right? You know, they set policies, they enforce them, and, you know, they have their right and left and right limits, if you will. But to what Asha also pointed out, the reason that disinformation campaigns by both foreign actors, Russia, especially in the last 4 years, and others have not proliferated to domestic also because we also have fundamental problems in our society, you know, fundamental problems in our democracy that it, you know, makes our society particularly vulnerable to these types of disinformation campaigns that are foreign or domestics. And when you paint that picture, when there are these opportunities to exploit, whether it's race relation, whether it's economic instability, whether it's COVID, whatever, you know, you pick whatever the issue is, climate change. I mean, again, pick the issue. When there's these issues to exploit, not only is it easier for these actors, foreign or domestics, to exploit them, but also on the social media side, they can only do so much. And therefore, you know, they're only one part of the pie in addressing this problem. And so they're not just 100%, the onus shouldn't be 100% on them, nor the solution set should be 100% on them. You can't do it 100% without the government as well as a civil society institution. You know, people, you know, now these days people have coined the term whole of society approach. In many ways it is. It's long, it's hard, it's not going to also happen simultaneously, right? But at the same time, it's, you know, it's one side of the, if you will, even just one aspect of the industry can't just do it alone, just because, you know, they're not going to, the one part they're not going to be able to do is they're not going to be able to solve all of these societal issues that, or the vulnerabilities in society that particularly make US or pick any other country, you know, vulnerable.
Sure. I mean, absolutely, right? We have to have some kind of, you know, greater awakening. But while we wait for that greater awakening, there are the immediate problems when you have riots breaking out and misinformation and disinformation on Facebook and Twitter that's not being taken down. On the one hand, right, to Asha's point, they're not going to be the ones to regulate themselves adequately. On the other hand, when you see, you know, folks in Congress who are much older, who don't use social media themselves, asking rather silly questions like, how does Facebook make money? It doesn't quite give the public the confidence that legislators have a handle on the problem. So on the one hand, we have engineers who don't understand history and politics, and then we have legislators who don't understand technology. Where is the middle ground? And is there a role for public policy to play? And can it play that role without suppressing free speech? Baybars, do you want to hit that one first? I gave you an easy one.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that. I definitely agree with Vera and Asha on their takes on the need for some sort of like, you know, monitoring and guidance onto the platforms to basically follow higher principles on this fight against misinformation. But I also want to raise another challenge that I have been seeing lately, which is the risks associated with regulation. I know we are mostly focusing on the US, or particularly since the subject of this panel is about the US elections, but I also want to raise some, you know, concerns about allowing or encouraging other, you know, decision makers around the world to also attempt regulating social media companies, probably with not the same, you know, tools and resources that we can, at least in the US and in other, you know, more established democracies, to provide guidance to the lawmakers and decision makers. So it has been a big challenge, particularly in the Southeast Asia and in different parts of Eastern Europe and growing in Africa. Governments are also using this whole concept of fake news and mis and disinformation to also suppress the flow of information in their countries. And in many cases, regulating tech is a very popular, you know, tool to do that, particularly in countries where there's also, you know, big, you know, xenophobia and also this populism populated in the discourse of the country. It can always lead up to, you know, some worse case scenarios. So I also wanted to just raise it as a concern, even though it doesn't make the big tech any, you know, more innocent than what they were back in pre-2016. I think if you allow me to take a step back and try to reflect on your question about the difference between disinformation in 2016 and now, I think now we see a much more top to bottom approach in the role of disinformation and its spread. And that's why we probably have been finding ourselves in focusing on individual cases, whereas
Can you expand on that? What do you mean by top to bottom?
Sure. I mean, from what I see in 2016 and the whole, you know, the process building up to the 2016 elections, and this is practically just, you know, focusing on the US elections, but I can take that from back to like 2013 to the uprisings in the Arab world. And I come from Istanbul, Turkey. So I experienced the popular Gezi Park protests in 2013 summer, and social media had a big impact both on those two different, you know, protests. So what I see similarities in those early protests in the first part of 2010s and the 2016 elections. The misinformation and disinformation was basically coming from user-generated content, and the tech companies were very, unfortunately, influential and instrumental in spreading those mis and disinformation, whether they are fueled by foreign powers like Russia or China, or in the case of other countries, different countries. They were mostly driven by a more bottom to top approach. But what I see for this year elections, not only necessarily in the US, but in different parts of the world as well, governments, powerful people in the society, opinion leaders, decision makers are also very active in spreading misinformation, using the amplification power of social media. That's something new I think we have compared to 2016. But I think it also makes our lives a bit harder because like it makes us to focus on individual cases where, let's say, Twitter imposes a label on a tweet by the president, or the president of Brazil, or Amazon, its subsidiary Twitch platform, bans the son of Bolsonaro in Brazil. Those high-profile examples are obviously making much more attention. But on the other hand, there always has been, there's another effort in parallel to this top-to-bottom approach, which is more handling misinformation at scale generated by users using those platforms. I think, at least I feel myself obliged to give credit to Facebook and Twitter to be, well, let me take a step back, to Facebook to be more active in handling this misinformation at scale, particularly generated by users. But when it comes to addressing the cases coming from high-profile figures, I think Twitter has been, putting much more, at least, visible effort, which makes our lives a bit harder as fact-checkers and industry experts to provide guidance to those tech companies to handle practically two different set of problems with same tools and resources. So I think that's gonna be our takeaway from this, election year, when we will be able to go back and try to reflect on our, experiences on this fight against misinformation.
One other thing Facebook is doing, if people haven't seen it, is that they're actually paying participants to engage in a study where they pay them to turn off their Facebook feeds, and they have to take a survey, and they're trying to measure the effect that Facebook has around election time on political sentiment. So that's also something to watch out for. There'll be a report coming mid next year. But yeah, you're right. There's multiple facets of the problem. There's no one solution. Al, I was wondering if you can tell us about the work that Logically does in fact checking. The people who are doing that hard work day in and day out, and what they're facing.
Sure. So I think Baybars is absolutely right to bring up the question of scale, and that's really that's really the kind of focus that we have at Logically in terms of our contribution to the fact checking, to the fact checking, to the network of fact checkers operating around the world. The problem is, I mean, there are several problems with just the notion of using fact checking to address the problems created by misinformation. So it's clearly an important part of the kind of tool set that we have to address these issues, because one way that you can try and stop a piece of misinformation in its tracks, clearly and obviously, is just to put out a piece of counter information or a counter narrative of some description. But the problem with the way misinformation operates that I think are continually, or continually beginning or we're beginning to see how impactful it is the fact that misinformation operates in kind of clearly distinct way on social media to information which comes from reputable and reliable news sources. So there is an additional challenge, even if, and we are quite successful at pushing out fact checks at scale, and there are a lot of initiatives to encourage fact checking to happen at greater scale and in a more responsive way. But even fact checking at scale doesn't address the problem that having all the fact checks in the world isn't going to serve as an effective counter to a misinformation narrative if it doesn't go where people are looking at the misinformation itself. So the extent to which misinformation circulates in a bubble or an echo chamber is the extent to which fact checking is might turn out to be an inadequate response to misinformation, or at least by itself, or failing some serious concerted effort to make sure that this information is put where people can see it.
So Vera, you had mentioned along similar lines that, you know, this is a multifaceted problem that's going to require big solutions. Could you go into more detail about, you know, some of the things that, you know, you are thinking about and how we can make Al's job easier?
So I think the first thing, you know, in terms of fact checking, I think fact checking is a very important tool, but it's one of those things where it can't, you know, it cannot be done in a vacuum. And so that kind of goes back to the earlier point that I made. If you think about it, the reason in some ways that we need fact checking is because we have the public and the electorate that most of it doesn't think critically about the information that they consume, does not verify their sources, does not corroborate the data. And then, oh, by the way, let's just not just talk about social media, but also how information proliferates. If you see something that's maybe false or maybe a half truth, then it gets proliferated via the friends and family route, which arguably in many ways it's even more powerful than social media because that's your like trusted sources, right? So when I talk about sort of like the civil society aspect, it's not just media literacy and increasing journalistic standards, and it's the simple things like actually starting with literacy, and I put it in quotes, from preschool for our kids. You know, we're right now, think about the fact that we're operating, you know, in a COVID environment. For all of us parents out there, we're dealing with virtual learning, you know, where the kids all of a sudden have to learn about how to actually digest information. It's also for adults as well. Again, it's not just, you know, traditionally it's also always been about the journalistic standards, making sure journalists have the right standards in place and can, you know, corroborate the data, corroborate their sources, and make sure they're not inadvertently spreading both, whether it's disinformation and misinformation. You know, on the industry side, there's a whole slew of things that can be, you know, that can be done. And I think to Asha's point, and I think to Baybars, you know, like there has been a lot of things that have been made and strides that have been made, certain other platforms. I feel like where they are now and trying to address election integrity issues to where they were, say, 2016 or even earlier when we first, you know, the whole thing that with Russia interfered in the US election came up. I mean, there's been significant improvement. Is it where it used to be 100%? No, there's plenty of more things to do in terms of adjusting policies, enforcement, you know, how do you actually treat, you know, public figures and officials that, you know, we have in this country, they're spreading disinformation, you know, all of that, right? And then and then to your point, Anafi, you said, you know, we have, you know, Congress, you know, you talk about regulation that, you know, that don't fully understand the extent of how a lot of social media works. And so when you think about regulation, and we have also free speech and Section 230 and all of that, like, how do you actually, like, bring actually them into the fold and have like that shared understanding, you know, that one shared understanding from government, from Congress, but one that does not cross the line of actually interfering with free speech. So a lot of thorny issues, but as you can see, it's almost like this weird triangle with kind of a layers underneath each side, if you will, that need to be addressed. But one of the things, the last thing I'll say is, there's a lot of efforts that already have been made and strides in this, but I think more needs to be done. The information sharing, the collaboration, the coordination, the synchronization, that needs to be also strengthened across the board as well to make this happen.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there.
Can I jump in, Anafi?
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to add one point on the fact-checking piece. I completely agree that it's a essential tool in our information landscape right now. But I think one thing that we need to also recognize is that part of the problem is that factual accuracy is not how people are making their decisions or consuming information. So when you look, and I think this goes to how we should be understanding this problem. Disinformation operations seek to hijack our cognitive processes, you know, and I think that piece is not fully understood. So we're not actually making, you know, unless you're like hyper self-aware and like really, you know, making an effort, you know, things like confirmation bias, the ability of, our emotions to overtake our rational thinking. All of these things are going to get in the way of actually, accepting facts that contradict our beliefs, especially in a society where there are deep tribal divisions, either based on partisan affiliation, race, religion, like very strong, ties that keep us, in a certain membership group. There's something called directional motivated reasoning, which basically studies on this suggest or indicate that when we're engaging in directional motivated reasoning, we aren't evaluating information based on the accuracy of the information presented, but we believe it because that belief signals our loyalty to and membership in a particular group. And therefore, we're going to be very resistant to facts because we don't really care about the facts. We're doing it because we say we don't want to be thrown out of our group. And we want to show that we are a member of that group. And I think that gets to what Vera was saying about the vulnerabilities in our society. I think one of the things that we need to really look at is the increasing tribalization that we have along many different dimensions, which make us susceptible to accepting information and making a lot of cognitive errors in the way that we consume it. And just to add, I think that there are media outlets that capitalize on this. I think there are politicians that capitalize on this. So again, it's an escalating situation. And I just wanted to throw that out there because I think we get frustrated when there's fact checking and people still believe what they believe. And you're like, well, what's wrong with you?
Right.
And I think just one more add to it. I think that's a brilliant point to that, because again, these kind of the underpinnings of this, and then even to add to that, there's this whole concept called reality apathy. Because of all of this information that we consume and people don't want to believe facts, people also just feel helpless within this environment that we're living in, and then
one of the questions we have is it practically possible for a common user to do a fact check on a day-to-day when they're bombarded with news through various mediums? Exactly.
We have this, we feel like as a society, it's just like when, again, you have information coming from all ends, to what Asha said, based on where you come from and kind of your, belonging, if you will, you may choose, you already have sort of kind of like, your bias or cognitive bias in place, whether or not you're going to believe it. And then given sort of the state of play where we are right now, certainly in American society, and, there's just, people just feel overall helpless and just also overwhelmed by all of this. So to the degree, we need fact checking, but we also have to recognize that there's this whole other problem where, fact checking it's an important piece, but it's not going to solve the full spectrum of the problems we're facing.
I feel responsible in jumping on exactly at this point, if you don't mind. I totally agree with you. The limitations and the challenges that we see in fact checking is definitely, worth of a separate conversation. I will be more than happy to be a part of that conversation, a much more longer sitting. I agree with all what Asha and Vera just said about like what people actually need more than just fact checking is like, I don't want to say even like media literacy. I think it's more like an education and also social coherence thing rather than just being able to read like the news. I think it's more than that. Again, coming from a polarized country to probably a much more polarized country in the last 2 years, I've been able to experience the downsides of doing fact checking in two different settings, but in two different, in two similar societies, basically, in terms of like the polarization and the tribalism. But I believe fact checking also has been at least attentive to adjust itself to this new reality, particularly to address the challenge of fact checking at scale. But I think we are now in the much more aware position as fact checkers to see that our individual fact checks do not necessarily make any big impact, but our collective effort to push platforms to provide context to users, and also the tech companies to communicate better among themselves, and then at the end of the day allow users to at least be able to get the factual information during their news dies, I think is a new step that we have been able to see in the last couple of years, probably in the last year or so.
One thing I wanted to talk with you, Baybars, actually is a couple months ago, I saw a story in the New York Times about a fact-checking group that Facebook had outsourced to in Ukraine called StopFake. And they were, found to have, whether or not, I don't want to spread misinformation, but there were questions about how nonpartisan they were in their fact-checking. And you're quoted as saying, actually, let me pull it up really quick. It says, you asked, they're working in a country, this is in Ukraine, they're working in a country where they're still practically in war with Russia. This is a question we also struggle with as fact-checkers. How do you do nonpartisan fact-checking when you have tanks on the street? And I think that was a really fascinating question, right? We think, oh, we have fact-checkers. There are these, view from nowhere type people who are going to come down and be the ultimate authority. But even when we have fact-checkers, there are still biases. When we have AI that's helping with the fact-checking, there are still biases. So how can fact-checkers do a better job? How can Facebook vet the fact-checkers to make sure these fact-checkers are actually doing the best that they can? And where do you see your institution fitting into that role?
Sure. Thanks a lot for raising this. For what it's worth, I did not say that particularly just for Ukraine. I think the problem that we have in terms of finding an answer to how to do fact-checking, nonpartisan fact-checking when you have tanks on the street was a question that we were discussing in Global Fact 2 years ago in Rome. So this is a question that we try to cope with every single day. It's not only about like whether there are tanks on the street or not, but I think in countries where you don't have the freedom of information or media, granted, I think that makes fact-checkers much more under scrutiny and under pressure to do much universal value-based journalism, and that's where we at least try to provide maybe not a ceiling, but at least a floor of standards to do nonpartisan and transparent fact-checking. We are not in a position to say that our verified signatories are 100% I would say they're transparent, but when it comes to their day-to-day fact-checking, they publish more than 1,000 fact checks a day from the 90 organizations that we work with. And in cases where they might be found failing short to meet the highest standards in nonpartisanship in their fact checks. But at least at the end of the day, our mandate is to provide the users visiting those fact-checking organizations' websites, being able to fact-check the fact-checkers themselves. Because if there is one question that we hear a lot, it's that who fact-checks the fact-checkers? I don't want to undersell the work of IFCN, but I can assure it's not us. It shouldn't be us, at least. It's right now us. But in an ideal world, it should be the users holding accountable those fact-checking websites to higher standards using the set of criteria that we provide them with. So that's what we try to do in IFCN with our pool of external and independent assessors. Right now, more than 145 in 74 different countries, if I'm not mistaken. And all applications are publicly available to just make sure the fact-checking websites also hold them accountable for their work. It's a tough question, and it's not only a question when there's a active conflict on the ground. Just think about like countries where you have one-party government and the majority of the public discourse is dominated by one party, and you expect fact-checkers to cover different sides equally. I mean, it's not that easy all the time. I mean, I believe fairness and transparency is a key component of assessing the fact-checking organizations, because at the end of the day, we all want to get our news from credible organizations, and that's not that different for fact-checking organizations as well.
We have a question from India. Any advice for opposition leaders or independent political candidates who lack the necessary resources to fight back against disinformation? Anyone?
Find some resources.
Right? I mean, there are some good fact-checking organizations out there. I mean, at the end of the day, fact-checking is mostly like a public, it's a public serving practice. It's a public interest practice. So I believe manufacturing organizations will be more than happy to see any politician using their work to build up their arguments, as long as that endorsement from a politician doesn't affect the work of fact-checking organizations. I believe that would be like a dream scenario for any organization to see a politician picking up their material and use it in the public discourse.
Circling back to the elections in the US, a question we have, maybe Asha, you can address this. Should fact-checking be mandatory during live debates in the run-up to the presidential election?
I don't know what mandatory means. I don't think there's any way you can force that to happen. Do I think it would be a good journalistic practice? Ideally, yes. I think, you know, again, going back to how we consume information, having a fact check at the time that you hear something for the first time will allow you to evaluate it more critically than once you've heard it and then you hear the correction come later. So ideally you would have like some kind of, you know, chyron or thing on the screen that would have that. Again, you encounter this problem when you have domestic actors who are actively promoting conspiracy theories and disinformation, because frankly, you have no idea what's going to come out of their mouth. You know, I know CNN, for example, has a fantastic fact checker named Daniel Dale. This man, I don't know how he does it, but he goes to every single Trump rally and, you know, every press conference and just sits there and tweets out, you know, fact checks. And there does come a point, this man has told 20,000 lies. Like, let's just get it out there. Where the fire hose of falsehood, as it were, it's just coming too fast to be able to do it. So I think to realistically do something like that, you would need something like, you know, a time delay on the debate to give time for the fact checkers to go look up whatever crazy thing has just been said. So ideally that would be the case. I think, and this goes back to the question with India, you know, you just have a different animal on your hands when you have these tactics adopted by people in positions of power. In India, you have an especially difficult problem because you also have an apparatus working on behalf of the government to promote disinformation, you know, getting more like what you see in authoritarian countries. And we also see some of that happening now in the United States, where our intelligence community, our legislators, our justice system is being co-opted into promulgating disinformation on behalf of the party in power. So to answer the question, yes, I think fact-checking during the debate would be ideal. I think it would be very difficult with the person that we have currently in office, given the amount of falsehood that he puts out, but it could be a start.
And
so go ahead.
I was going to say, if I may add also to that, you know, absolutely, you know, I think it's not just the challenge of doing this in real time and the ability for the public to digest, but also think about the spin machine, if you will, after the fact that's going to come out, and they will come out based on whatever the candidate said or what the fact checker is saying as well. You know, and I think we need to take into account for that. And then again, back to on our end, on us as voters consuming the information, watching the debate on, you know, whatever channel it is or online, you know, like, okay, well, great. Like, okay, there's now the spin, there's now the candidate, there's now the fact checker. What do we believe? Right? And so there lies the challenge in practical terms.
Very much literally called the spin room. Go ahead.
I mean, I just shared a link on the chat box, and I just realized that I did that prematurely without, you know, providing a context on why I did share that. But there are some promising, you know, news on the automated fact-checking front. We have been able to build a repository of fact checks that are being published to the open web, which is done through Claim Review, a schema that has been developed in partnership with tech platforms. and fact-checking organizations publish their fact checks using this claim review infrastructure, and then the automated fact-checking can work in a way, and it already works in smaller scales as we speak right now, can surface the fact checks that already have been published by fact checkers and match with the claims detected in any given real-time speech. So it is possible, and there has been some tests, and practically like some pilots have been done in the last two State of the Union addresses. So if that's going to be the case for, let's say, for the presidential debates, with the database of fact checks published by fact-checking organizations and colleagues like Daniel Dale and others, it's not that hard actually to put fact checks on the screen real time, obviously with some delays in screen, but they're not more than like 6 to 7 seconds with this new with the current technology that we have. For those who are interested in those developments, feel free to check out the link that I just shared from poynter.org. But that would be like a very interesting way to put fact checkers together with the politicians on a real-time manner. And it happens in countries like Italy, in South Korea. So there are already some examples that fact checkers utilize the claim review and other materials to pull those fact checks on a real-time debate.
Thank you. That's really helpful. One of the questions we had was, how can journalists fight against fake news? So that's really helpful. I mean, something else I'll just throw in. One thing I see that frustrates me is they lead with the false information instead of creating that truth sandwich where they say, this is the truth, this is what was said, and then again, this is the truth, because repetition for our tiny human brains is very powerful. So whenever you're trying to correct misinformation, always lead with the truth. Al, I was wondering if you can share other tips that fact checkers might have to help the journalists and politicals in attendance fight against fake news, and what they can do to amplify the fact checkers' message to the public.
Yeah, I'd love to answer that question by harping back to something that Asha said a while ago, a couple of good, really good points that Asha made. So it's incredibly important, as Asha and Vera did, to bring up the idea of cognitive biases and the role that they play in the way that misinformation spreads. Something I think is really, really important for anyone who's interested in combating misinformation to do is to be very careful in identifying what problems are new, what problems have just been intensified by the kind of ecosystem that we find ourselves in, and what has kind of ever been thus. So we do form our politics on the basis of things like emotional responses and cognitive biases, but these are things that have been the case like since politics has been a thing. Similarly, like political rhetoric has been misleading almost by its very nature since at least ancient Rome. So there are so I get kind of leery when I hear people say things like, or when I hear people describe the way that people apparently don't respond well to facts or to being corrected as a new phenomenon. I think there are lots of cases where there are kind of existing political structures which have been kind of shoehorned into this new technology in a way which exacerbates a lot of maybe slightly unhealthy habits that that democratic populations already had. Things like preferring explanations which favor your in-group, things like confirmation bias. And I think that speaks kind of really profoundly to one of the reasons, to a serious limitation of fact-checking as it has kind of developed as a political, as a journalistic institution, which is that because fact-checking developed directly from the kind of newsroom role of literally going through a story, highlighting everything which could be challenged in a court, and making sure that that information is accurate. Because fact-checking as we know it now grew out of that practice, it is, I think, and I think most people on the panel have kind of have implied this, overly concerned with capital F facts, and is not sufficiently concerned with giving people an understanding of what a particular claim means in the context of political rhetoric, right? So what's really important, and something that I have been very aware of in developing the ways that we do fact checking it logically, is understanding the claims that politicians make not as simple factual statements, but as pieces of political communication, right? So if and this I think is borne out in some of the, let's say, some of what I would describe as not very savvy fact checking habits that people have of marking things say false, where they are like where the general gist of the thing that a politician has said may be reasonable, but because they maybe got a figure wrong, it comes out as false. And this is a thing which I think helps to undermine the position of fact checkers as non-partisan and politically neutral, because there's kind of confusion over what fact checkers do and should be doing. And there's also, I mean, I think the point that Baybars made is incredibly important about the difficulties of non-partisanship. And I think, like, again, one of the reasons that fact checkers have come under increased scrutiny recently, and there is less trust in the institution than maybe there used to be, is again because it grew out of this practice of establishing beyond doubt things that were very easy to establish beyond doubt. It's a practice that was never meant to make sense of political rhetoric writ large. So now that we are, and it seems like that's what a lot of us are trying to do. So kind of the take. So if I could say one thing in this panel, it would be those who are minded to use fact checking as a tool to combat misinformation should try very hard to think about how facts work in political rhetoric and not just in isolation. And if we can try and help people understand the way that political rhetoric operates, like by reference to facts, absolutely. But in that context, I think that is kind of the big thing that we can do to make fact checking as an institution more effective.
So if I can just piggyback on Al's point, which is on the money here in terms of understanding sort of not just fact checking as a practice, but the political rhetoric piece of it. And so that I think let's just imagine what's going to happen on November 3rd and thereafter, where there's a high likelihood we may not know the full results of the US election on that day. And the role that then this political rhetoric from both sides and this sort of the spin machine will take place, and then how, if you will, sensitive fact checkers will need to be in making sure that they're providing the facts and fact checking the information, yet also taking into account some of the, if you will, the rhetoric and the nuances around this. So I think, I think after my personal view, and I'm very curious to hear others on the panel here, one is we are very unlikely to know the results to see who is the, whether President Trump has won the re-election or we have Vice President Biden has won. But it's also there, I just anticipate there being a slew of disinformation campaigns that are going to follow, particularly in that space between November 3rd and whenever the election results get certified. So I'm actually, on one hand, I think fact checking is going to be extremely important, but on the other hand, I'm actually concerned about just 100% reliance on fact checking because of this broader spin. So that's just my perspective, but I'm curious other points of view on this topic.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think those were excellent points. And I was noticing there was a question in the Q&A about web literacy, media literacy, which we talk about a lot. But this conversation has also made me think, and especially being a lawyer, that I think actually it would be helpful to train people, and maybe in school, on rhetoric, argumentation, how we use evidence to support a conclusion. In law school, this is what we learn. And so you understand that what the difference between a strong argument and sophistry, because I think that's exactly right. If we're just looking at facts in isolation, and this is right and this is wrong, and not really understanding how these facts or inaccurate pieces of evidence are being marshaled in support of a larger, goal, there's a lot of stuff that gets lost in the weeds. And I think, I was looking up at my shelf. I have a brilliant book by a colleague, Dr. Jennifer Mercica, and it's called The Rhetorical Genius of Donald Trump. And she goes through very classical rhetorical techniques, that he employs. So for one example, that would actually make it very hard for a fact checker. So for example, one rhetorical strategy is called paralypsis. Paralypsis is saying something and then also saying its opposite. There might be voter fraud through mail-in ballots. I just heard this. I mean, I don't know. Some people are saying. And so, is he making a factual assertion? There's this, some people are saying, and so there's this plausible deniability around it. If you're focusing on the facts, you don't understand what's being done. But when you zoom back and you understand the rhetorical strategy here, it's avoiding accountability while creating doubt around a democratic process and trying to foster that doubt. And so I guess it was just very illuminating to hear these comments before me, because it does make me think that, some of these classical, training in rhetoric and argumentation, which students learn in writing, but I think also in oratory, might be helpful as well, in addition to media literacy and digital literacy, the things that we normally talk about.
That's awesome, and absolutely true. I want to go through all of the panelists we only have 7 minutes left. So we've seen, we've discussed this about the lack of trust, whether it's in the tech companies, whether it's our lawmakers, whether it's the fact checkers who Facebook is outsourcing to. So there's this distrust of really all institutions. We're seeing a dip in poll numbers for the military now as well, which is normally, enjoys high public support. One, what can institutions do? One thing that, pick any of the institutions, what can they do to ensure that they have more trust moving forward? And then what can the average person do? Whether it's downloading the Logically extension or something else. So one action item for one institution and one action item for the average person. Whoever would like to start.
I'll start to go to grab the easy answers first. So institutionally, they've got to put their money where their mouth is. We have been, 2016 was a shock. It shouldn't have been a shock. The last 4 years, everybody has everyone has been reading, recovering, analyzing, doing autopsy after autopsy of the 2016 result. And yet in the fact-checking community, I'm sure Baybars will attest to this, there is insufficient investment, there is insufficient interest from government and civil societies in, fact-checking is just kind of the word that we use for this large counter misinformation network that we have, right? So it's not necessarily about fact-checking, but there is just, I've only been in this field for a year, and when I came into it, I was shocked and appalled at how ill-prepared and how uninterested governments and civil society and the tech sector seem to be in addressing what seems like what everyone seemed to agree was like the most pressing democratic crisis that we had. So institutionally, put your money where your mouth is. Individually, I should say download the Logically app, but I will say instead, you need to talk to people like face to face, because we know that misinformation spreads in the online ecosystem. We know that, and we know that the best way to change somebody's mind is with a face-to-face conversation. It's all very well evidenced. Shouting at people on Twitter might work, but talk to people in real life about their politics, about how they're going to vote, present them with information, have long conversations. That's the way you change people's minds. It's important to do the shouting down on Twitter and the posting of fact checks, especially from Logically, but the most effective thing that you can do to stop the spread of misinformation is talk to people that you know about it.
Thank you.
I can maybe just, echo what Elle said. First of all, go and use fact-checking websites. I mean, try to get the most out of them. Many of them have been, doing their best to widen their audiences, and I'm pretty sure you will be able to, find them wherever you are looking from, either on social media or directly on their website. And recently, growingly, more organizations even defer to platforms like WhatsApp and other messenger apps to also build more one-on-one communication with their audiences. So wherever you are from, feel free to use them. From our perspective, we have been trying to bring fact checks together with end users in a much more global scale. So recently we have built a fact-checking chatbot on WhatsApp for the COVID-19 falsehoods, and I'm strongly encouraging everyone to check out that bot on WhatsApp. I can just drop the link here for those who are interested, and then reach out to the fact checkers wherever you are participating to this panel from, and get the most accurate information. But those are just like small tactics that can help people on a daily basis. But for the long term, I agree with Elle that first of all, the companies, the tech companies should provide more resources to this problem, not to just like save the day, but to come up with more applicable and long-term solutions to help people to not be subject of disinformation campaigns on social media platforms. I think that's the more important thing that we need to address. And from the first fact checkers' point of view, I think our community also needs to come up with more sustainable solutions to fund their work. We need to be more independent of funding coming from tech companies and be more self-sufficient. And I think the best way to do that is going to be owning our own data, which has been utilized to push content moderation decisions by platforms. So we need to also make sure data is independent and also used for public good, and in a way to also provide sustainable business models for fact checkers in the long term as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'll go.
Okay.
So I would say institutionally, I think that there are more affirmative duties that the government can put on tech platforms. And what I mean by that is that the idea that these tech platforms are neutral is just, that's a incorrect proposition. Neutrality in this case favors bad actors, even as they are trying to combat that. And earlier I made a comparison between tech companies and tobacco companies, and I think that they really are the new tobacco. They're pretty unhealthy for you. They get you addicted. They might bring you some satisfaction, but at the end of the day, they're a net, in my opinion, public not loss, I guess. And so similar to how the government forces tobacco companies to put labels on their cartons, engage in give money for anti-smoking campaigns. I think that the government could force or could ask tech or make tech companies do things like provide affirmative civic information. Like imagine that every time you logged onto Twitter, you had, a big screen that gave you 3 facts about voting, which you read and then you had to click out of, or, a quick quiz. What is the difference between news and opinion? And they give you the definitions, and then, or they make you make a choice and then give you the correct answer. Small things that make the user stop and get something positive about how they are interacting with the information that they're getting, I think could be a very easy step that could be done that doesn't really depend on the changing technology. As far as what people can do, number one, delete your Facebook account. That's my advice. And then to go back to what Al said, yes, I think that we need to be more responsible about interacting in person, not only because of how misinformation spreads, but that's also how we create social trust in a democracy. And social trust is a natural prophylactic against, being divided along, the lines that we're currently being divided against. I mean, if you've met your neighbor, you probably like them and you trust them, and you may not even know how they vote. That is something that's been definitely fragmented with the introduction of social media and internet. And we spend about 7 hours a day online now compared to what we did before. So get outside. Let's stay 6 feet away from people.
Maybe also not. And I'm in California right now, where the sky is bright orange from all the smoke fire. So, judiciously be outside. Absolutely. So to piggyback to a lot of the other panelists would have said, let me just start first with the voters, with the public. Absolutely. To Al and Asha. I mean, I've looked at this problem and been addressing in different parts of the world where I've been fortunate to be on the ground in different countries. You can't really, there's something about that face-to-face interaction and building those, interpersonal relationships and how you build trust that just really trumps anything that you might see on social media. So that's one, for sure. On the public side also, again, when we're just completely bombarded by all of this information, whether it's true or false or something in between, we're also facing with this whole sensationalized information that elicits emotional response, right? Even just the headline or the title of whatever article or whatever the post, whether it's on social or mainstream media. So to that, we really, as consumers of that information, need to think before we click, if you will, right? Because again, you see something, it kind of elicits a response, then you go and you're going to tell your spouse, your parent, your friend, or whoever else, right? So there's that piece. On the institutional side, I think, again, on the sensationalism aspect of it, I think, both media in particular needs to, wait it out to see, do we need to report this? Is it, do we need to report this information? Can it wait? So there needs to be on that end. And then to what Asha said in terms of, in just broader sort of Congress and tech and regulation, there have been strides that have made, and positive strides from platforms in an effort to push transparency of the information that they, of the data, of also how they're enforcing their policies. But I think we need to see more of it. We need to see more transparency at various degrees, to the degrees that information can be shared, to not only inform the public, but also to inform the governments as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I hope people were taking notes, because these were all really great action items. Let's see, there's some links here. Al and Baybars, if you wouldn't mind sharing the links you had shared earlier one more time in the chat for the panelists, for the attendees. I think we can just about wrap it up. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, panelists.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Signing off.
Take care.